coming to you 4 weeks late. Welcome back to the deep dive. This is your host, Sydney Nadiancio. I'm very sorry that we forgot to post an episode for a little while. I kind of got a little behind, but we're back here on the deep dive with Sydney Nadiancio, and we are at our first pivotal moment episode. So I promised you guys that we would do a pivotal moment episode every 5 chapters. But even though we're already at chapter 2, I do believe that there is more we need to be discussed. Because while they do talk about this in the later chapters, I feel like chapters 1 and 2 are the most primarily focused on this. Now, of course, there are other chapters that kind of explain what people's response to this is and how people go to their day-to-day life. But chapters 1 and 2 really explain emotional suppression. Now, someone had wrote a comment for the podcast named Super Unicorn. Hello, Sydney. Thanks for creating this podcast. Thanks for breaking down the chapters of The Giver and summarizing them into a nutshell. Even magic cannot explain the slightest differences in dystopian novels. And thanks, Super Unicorn, for writing that comment, because you are correct. They don't really talk about this in middle school, wherever you read The Giver. They sort of just, read the book and continue on. They don't really go into depth on why people are this way. Even if you're not reading it in middle school, they still talk about things in a way, like when you read The Giver by yourself, you might not understand it fully until you read it the second time. And this is why we do these pivotal moment episodes, to further help you guys understand the book. So we already discussed chapter 1 and chapter 2, right? We already discussed both of these chapters and how characters are affected and how the emotional suppression works. Now, just to summarize, chapter 1, we are kind of meeting Jonas and hearing that he's going to turn 12. Chapter 2, we learn a little bit more about the naming ceremony and the comfort objects and how there's ceremonies for different ages, so no one really has a real birthday. Your birthday is whenever the ceremony for your age happens. Now, I'm going to talk about the different emotional suppression tools used by the community in The Giver in order. Not in order of chapter, but in order of in which they take place. So obviously, now we're going to learn this later in the book. I'm going to spoil it now though, because I do feel like it is important to this episode. There are these birth mothers. Now their job is to carry the children, to essentially be pregnant with the children and give birth to them once they are ready to be born. Now, once these children are born, obviously they do not stay with their birth mother. They are actually transported to the nurturing center. So that bond that the baby had with their mother through pregnancy and through being born is being taken away. So this is the first emotional trauma that they're being put through. They're probably not going to remember it later, but for a baby, that is a well-known emotional trauma to not be able to bond with their parents. Now, once they're taken to the nurturing center, now it does not explicitly state this in the book, but in chapter 2, we can infer from what Jonas and his family are dealing with, since Jonas's father is a nurturer, is that each baby is assigned a nurturer who they kind of bond to. So, to refresh your memory, folks, the nurturing center is where babies are cared for, fed, and played with. So it's essentially where they develop until they are ready to be named and adopted. So we learn that there seems to be that they are assigned to one nurturer, and that nurturer they are assigned to, they even go home with overnight. If you remember that Jonas's father brought Gabriel home overnight. Now again, this is an inference we can make from Jonas's family, but once that baby is ready to be quote unquote assigned or adopted, they are essentially ripped away from their nurturer and assigned to their new family. Again, another emotional trauma. So these are basic emotional traumas that they go through. Now, I know I said we're going to be talking about this in order, but one part I'm going to mention, and I'm mentioning it now because this actually goes into the more advanced emotional traumas that the child is going to experience as they age, the ones they probably will remember. The children are born with comfort objects. Now, as we discussed in Chapter 2, a comfort object is usually a toy or a stuffed animal. Jonas remembers his being called a bear, so they believe that animals are not real. Now, Lily has a comfort object too, but it's going to be taken away from her once she turns 8. Now, these comfort objects were likely used to teach them as young children, oh, if you're crying right now, your comfort object will make you feel better. Oh, you're having scary feelings at night. The comfort object will make you feel better. So it is something that is meant to have high emotional significance in their lives. And of course, the nurturers probably use it, their adopted family probably uses it, until that child turns 8. They're going to have that, once they turn 8, they're going to have that comfort object taken away. Now, 8 is not even the age where, I wouldn't even say for most people, it's the age where you grow out of that. Some people do grow out of stuffed animals by the time they turn 8, but it's kind of 50-50. Some children do, other children do not. And so it seems like 8 is maybe a little too early, but they take it away from them because it's going to make them sad. Obviously, it had high emotional significance in their lives, and now they don't have it anymore, so they're sad. Now, this is obviously normal because, like I said, they're probably taught that these comfort objects have a lot of meaning. Now, not only is their comfort object, their so-called comfort object, taken away once they turn 8, but they have to complete quote-unquote volunteer hours to get them ready to go to work. So guys, not only is their toy being taken away that made them happy, but now they gotta get ready to be adults, even though they're only 8. And so they volunteer at whatever place they're interested in, whether it's the nurturing center, the rehabilitation center, the school, the house of the old, wherever it happens to be that they are volunteering. Apparently the elders observe them and take into account where the children are volunteering so they can create assignments for them once they turn 12. Now, of course, they're going to be doing these volunteer hours for maybe a few years, and by then, emotional trauma is kind of just normal for them. Now, obviously, in school, they're taught not to use strong language. If you remember, Jonas was taught not to use the word distraught. So, of course, it's not just strong language like, dude, you can't say a swear word in class, like that's not okay. No, it's something more than that. They're saying, no, the word distraught is way too strong. So teaching kids to use words of contentment and to never use expressive vocabulary. So this is another form of emotional suppression That happens throughout the years when they're in school. But by now, when they're doing these volunteer hours, they're sort of becoming accustomed to emotional suppression because they deal with it. They dealt with it when they dealt with trauma when they were born. So, of course, trauma and suppressing their emotions is a normal thing with them. They had their nurturers taken away from them. They had their comfort objects taken away from them when they're 8, which they can probably remember. And of course, they're going to get over it and say, oh, it's an emotion I shouldn't have had. Because this is what happens in real life with emotions. People will feel a certain way about a change or a rite of passage they had a few years ago, maybe sadness, maybe happiness, whatever the feeling. Later, they begin to disregard that feeling and think that it was in the past and it doesn't matter now. That's sort of what happens when the comfort object is taken away. Because the comfort object had a high amount of significance in their lives. It was probably most likely used to comfort them, to help them fall asleep. So it was sort of something that they were taught to cling to until they turned 8. So it's not just one trauma or one rite of passage. It's not like getting over training toothpaste when you're ready to use regular mint toothpaste. It is that something that had a lot of significance in your life is now being taken away from you, and you're not allowed to have that anymore. Now, once they start looking past it and realizing that, or thinking that it doesn't really matter anymore, and that it was a rite of passage for that amount of time or for that day, and now it's gone, now they don't have to worry about it anymore. That is sort of the mindset that they sort of adopt. And when you are taught that to suppress any emotion, or you go through any emotional experience, a few years later, you tend to think back on it and belittle yourself because you think that you reacted too harshly in that situation and you shouldn't have felt the way you did. Only this is a significant situation, and that is how people are feeling about it because it's happening to them when they are a kid. Now, by the time they're quote-unquote 12s and ready to receive their assignments, like I said, it's probably normal for them. They're probably just going with the flow. They more than likely can't see beyond. They aren't very emotional. They kind of have their own thoughts that they just go along with the flow. And that is when they receive their assignments by the time they're 12. And not only that, but they're taken away from their quote-unquote group of 11s. So their friends, the friends they had for all those years, and now they're with their assignment group, which again may still be harsh on them, but they're no longer kids. It might be hard for them to say goodbye to friends, but by now they're probably unsure of how to express themselves and either don't have emotions or are trying hard not to express emotions. And that is essentially how this community works in The Giver. Now let's talk a little bit more about keeping the community young, because that is another tool of emotional suppression that they use. They keep the community young. So, of course, we've heard this term releasing. I prefer not to spoil that because that's going to be another pivotal moment episode that we talk about later, because I think there's other things I want to sort of tie into the whole releasing theme, tie into that whole concept, is that people are sent to the house of the old when they're pretty young, like we were talking about, maybe 25. They're still pretty young. It's not like they're old people. They're basically just not teenagers anymore. That's the only thing that sets them apart from everyone else. So when they're taken here, it's essentially like they're essentially told that they're taken care of, all these things are done for them. And of course, they have a date where they are set to be released. We still don't know what